Every morning, my Bible opens itself to a different page. And every page carries a note I never wrote. At first, I thought it was the wind. I live alone, in a narrow brick house behind the old church, where the air smells like wax and paper. My hands still remember how to handle the fragile pages. I've restored holy books for more than 40 years. That's my craft. Miriam Cole, 62, restorer of sacred texts. But this morning, the handwriting stopped me cold. It wasn't mine. It was his. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's signing your own verdict again. The pen stroke, that slow curve at the end of the word again, belonged to Daniel. My husband. He died 9 years ago. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The room felt heavier, thick with the scent of old ink and candle smoke. A drop of wax slid down the candlestick beside the Bible, freezing halfway like a tear that never fell. I reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of the paper, and my chair scraped against the wooden floor. The sound cut through the silence like a confession. The words were fresh. I could tell. The ink was still wet. "Daniel," I whispered, "what did you leave for me?" No answer, only the faint rustle of a page turning itself. Something in me shifted. Not fear exactly, but that deeper kind of dread, the kind that whispers you already know the truth, you just don't want to read it. I used to believe that silence was sacred. Daniel taught me that. Now, silence feels like someone else is in the room, reading aloud where I can't hear. I stood there until the candle went out. Then I closed the Bible. Slowly, as if it could scream, and pressed my hand over the cover. The leather was warm, like it had a pulse. I've never been afraid of ghosts. What terrifies me is the truth, when it learns how to write letters by hand. People think faith is loud. Choirs, sermons, the echo of Amen through stone halls. But for me, faith was the sound of a pen scratching paper at 2 in the morning. For 35 years, that was my life with Daniel. He preached, I copied. I met him when I was 26, a visiting theology graduate who came to our small-town church to revive the word. His voice was soft but deliberate, like someone who knew that even silence could be persuasive. I was the girl who repaired hymnals, fixed broken spines, and sewed pages back into old Bibles that smelled like dust and hope. He told me once, "God doesn't live in stone walls, Miriam. He hides in ink." I believed him, not because he was right, but because he said it like a man who already knew what I wanted to hear. By the time I turned 30, we were married. By 40, I was copying his sermons by hand, line by line, into parchment books he called the Living Word. He wanted to print them, to share them, to save souls. I wanted to save him. We couldn't afford a printer then. So I sold my mother's piano, $2,400. Then my jewelry, $1,800. Then the house my parents left me. We moved into a smaller one behind the church. Red bricks, one window that caught the sunrise. Daniel said the light reminded him of resurrection. To me, it just looked honest. It showed every crack in the wall. Over 3 years, I copied and bound every word he wrote. 120 books in total, each one with pages sewn by hand. $42,000, every cent of our savings, went into his dream. We mailed each copy ourselves, wrapped in brown paper and string, the way missionaries used to send holy letters. My fingers would sting from the rope burns, but I told myself it was a holy kind of pain. I remember the smell of our living room back then: glue, candle wax, coffee. I used to hum hymns under my breath, trying to match the rhythm of my handwriting. When Daniel passed by, he would touch my shoulder, and for that moment, I felt the ache was worth it. He wasn't cruel. That's what made it harder to see. He was kind, but only in the way a sculptor is kind to marble. Patient, careful, but always reshaping it into something else. On the cover of the first copy we finished, he wrote in silver ink, "Every word you copy is a prayer I owe." He slipped the note under my hand, as if he were giving me a vow. I kept that copy in a glass case, the one with the silver fountain pen we used, the one engraved D&M Cole. The pen became our relic, our shared heartbeat in metal form. Whenever I touched it, I could almost hear his voice again. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wake to find him at his desk, eyes closed, whispering to himself before he wrote. He said the words came from above, that he was merely the vessel. I didn't question it, not once. That was my sin, not the believing, but the refusing to doubt. When the first book shipment went out, Daniel held my hand and said, "If one person finds God through our words, it will all be worth it." I smiled, thinking he said, "our." Later, I realized he never meant it that way. For years, I became invisible in my own house of faith, the silent typist behind his glory. People at the church would call me Mrs. Cole, the faithful wife, and I'd nod, pretending that title didn't sound like a chain. Every Sunday, I sat in the third pew, watching him speak words I had written, phrases I had edited, lines I had traced until my fingers cramped. No one knew I was the one who preserved his sermons, corrected his grammar, kept his pages dry when the roof leaked. I was proud. Then, pride has such a sweet disguise when you call it love. When he fell ill, I promised him I'd finish copying the last sermon. The Mercy Within. He dictated from bed, his voice softer now, but his words sharper than ever. I still remember the last line he wrote before his hands gave up. Truth has no owner, only those who dare to copy it without altering a single word. He looked at me, smiled faintly, and whispered, "That's you, Miriam. You never alter anything." I thought he meant it as a blessing. Now I'm not so sure. He passed that winter. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets. At the funeral, the pastor read one of Daniel's passages, one I had copied 100 times. My hands were raw from folding paper cranes out of his drafts. They looked like prayers that didn't know where to fly. Afterward, I sealed the silver pen in a small wooden box. I couldn't throw it away. It felt like throwing away the years I spent being faithful. I kept restoring books after that, but never again for the church. Just private collectors, people who paid well but never asked me to pray over the pages. That kind of silence felt cleaner. Still, every time I saw the old Bible on my desk, I felt him somewhere behind me, not as a ghost, but as an echo. I hadn't stopped answering. It's strange how grief behaves like ink. It fades, but it stains. And maybe that's why, when the first note appeared in my Bible last week, written in his hand, on the page I had restored myself, I didn't scream. I just stared. Because deep down, part of me was waiting for him to write again. It started with a whisper of ink. I was binding an old hymnal that morning, sunlight crawling across my work table, when the Bible on the other side of the room fell open on its own. The sound was soft, like a breath through dry paper. I wiped my hands, crossed over, and saw it, page 314 of the Gospel of John, a passage I had restored years ago. Only now, there was something different. Between the printed verses, in faint handwriting, a line curved across the margin. "You didn't write these words." The letters were familiar yet uncertain, like Daniel's hand after the illness had begun. For a second, I thought I'd miscopied the text during restoration. I leaned closer. The ink was new, the black still bluish at the edges, the pen pressure heavier than mine. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was embarrassment, the kind you feel when you realize you've made a mistake no one else would notice. I laughed under my breath. "Steady, Miriam," I muttered. "Maybe your hands shake more than you thought." I fetched my reading glasses, but even through the lenses the line remained. Clean, deliberate, written by someone who wanted to be seen. That afternoon, I tried to forget it. I blamed the draft, the light, my imagination. After all, what could be stranger than finding a ghost with good penmanship? But the next morning, another page had changed. This time, in the Book of Psalms, he never meant those prayers. The handwriting matched the first. Precise, restrained, almost respectful, as if the intruder didn't want to damage the page, only correct it. I checked the locks. I checked the windows. Nothing. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish, the same as always. Still, the air felt heavier, like someone had just left. I tried to laugh again, but it came out thin. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe that was what grief finally did. It learned to write back. For days, I told no one. There was no one to tell. My son lives 3 states away and calls once a month out of duty, not affection. The church ladies would only smile politely and pray at me. So I kept it to myself. And each morning, I'd glance at the Bible like a gambler checking his luck. The words kept appearing. Different ink shades, same hand. Small corrections. As if someone was editing my faith. One note read, "Stop calling it his gospel." Another, scrawled in the margin of Revelation, "Truth was never meant to be bound." Each new phrase slid deeper under my skin. I began leaving the Bible closed at night, pressing a paperweight on top, as if that could hold the words down. It never worked. By dawn, a different page would be open. The candle beside it burned lower than I remembered. Once, I thought I saw movement, a shadow crossing behind the curtain, long after midnight. I turned on the light, and there was nothing. Just the silver pen in its box, catching the lamplight like a watchful eye. I started keeping a journal, writing down the dates, the passages, the phrases. I wanted evidence, something tangible to prove I wasn't slipping. But even in my journal, the sentences looked unfamiliar, as though my hand no longer obeyed me. There's a particular loneliness in doubting your own handwriting. It feels like your soul is forging your signature. On the 7th day, I found the note that changed everything. It was written across the very dedication page Daniel had signed before his death. "I'm not the one writing anymore." The words were clean, final, perfectly centered, as if whoever wrote them understood punctuation better than I ever did. I sat there for a long time, the house silent except for the clock in the kitchen ticking like a heartbeat out of rhythm. I tried to tell myself that maybe, somehow, Daniel had written those lines before he died, hidden them between the pages, waiting for time and air to expose the ink. But deep down I knew. These strokes were new, fresh. Someone or something was still writing. I pressed my palms together, ink smudging onto my skin, and whispered the only prayer I could manage. "Lord, if this is mercy, please choose a quieter way to send it." Then I closed the Bible and turned the key in the study door, the sound sharp and final. The metal of the lock was cold against my fingers, and I caught myself glancing toward the box that held the silver pen. That night, I dreamed of Daniel's hand, reaching not to hold mine, but to take the pen back. They held the memorial service for Daniel on a Sunday so bright, it almost felt staged. The church bells rang longer than usual, the kind of ringing meant to make sorrow sound holy. I wore the same gray coat I'd worn to his funeral 9 years earlier. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The pews were packed. Students of his sermons, the few parishioners who still used his book The Living Word, and newcomers who came only because grief makes a good show. They placed Daniel's portrait on the altar, his face mid-smile, the corner of his mouth curved like he was seconds from telling the world what it had gotten wrong. I sat in the back, far from the choir. The light through the stained glass fell in squares on the floor, red and gold like spilled wine. On the lectern rested something I recognized instantly. The Bible from my study. The one that had been changing. Its cover looked heavier under the church light, almost breathing. Father Alden adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. He spoke gently at first, reading the familiar verses Daniel had once preached. Mercy, obedience, faith through trial. I mouthed the words out of habit, as though my lips still remembered the rhythm of copying them. Then he paused, looked down at the open page, and read something I'd never heard in a pulpit before. "Forgiveness isn't weakness," he said, voice lifting. "It's signing your own verdict again." The congregation murmured, soft gasps, a rustle of agreement, and then applause. Applause. In a church. For a sentence that was never Daniel's. My chest went cold. The sound blurred, as if the clapping came from underwater. That line? The handwriting, the one that had appeared on its own, was now echoing from the altar, recited as gospel. My knees trembled. I gripped the pew in front of me so tightly my nails left dents in the varnish. Every instinct told me to stand up, to shout. That isn't his, but the words jammed in my throat. When the applause quieted, Father Alden smiled faintly. Those, he said, were among Reverend Cole's final reflections, found in his personal Bible, lovingly preserved by his devoted wife, Mrs. Thais. Miriam Cole. Heads turned toward me. I felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes. Pity, admiration, curiosity, all pressing down. He continued. Her dedication allowed us to discover these divine addendums. A true miracle. My heartbeat stumbled. Addendums. He made it sound like scripture kept evolving on its own, as if heaven had chosen my pen to keep the story going. But it hadn't. Someone had chosen for me. I stood before I knew I was standing. My voice came out hoarse. Father, where did you read that line? He blinked, startled by the interruption. From the handwritten copy you donated, Mrs. Cole, he said gently, as though speaking to a frail woman. The one you entrusted to the archive last year. I shook my head. I never wrote those words. A ripple moved through the pews. Small gasps, whispered questions. I could feel their eyes measuring me, deciding whether grief had made me delusional. The organist's hands hovered uncertainly over the keys. Father Alden's smile didn't fade, but it stiffened around the edges. Perhaps you don't recall, my dear. Sometimes inspiration comes through us without our knowing. That patronizing calm, soft, holy, practiced, was worse than anger. You're wrong, I said louder now. Those pages were altered. He raised a hand for quiet, speaking in the tone priests reserve for stubborn sinners. Let us remember, Mrs. Cole, the Lord works in mysterious, not through forged ink. The echo of my voice bounced off the vaulted ceiling, sharp and raw. The church went utterly still. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the whispers began again, thin and cutting. Is she saying the miracle's fake? Maybe she's jealous of his legacy. Poor woman, she's lost. Father Alden closed the Bible slowly, like sealing a coffin. Let us pray for peace, he said. Some truths are too heavy for one heart alone. He turned his back to me, facing the altar, and began reciting a prayer. The congregation followed. The sound rolled over me like rain I couldn't stop. I sat down because standing made me dizzy. My hand shook so hard that the silver cross around my neck clinked against the pew. The air smelled of incense and betrayal. All I could think was that somewhere, in the quiet between verses, someone had rewritten my husband's faith and signed my name beneath it. When the prayer ended, people began filing out, murmuring their condolences as if I were the widow twice over. I stayed seated until the last candle burned halfway down, staring at the closed Bible on the altar. It looked peaceful. It looked like victory. And I understood then that lies, told in God's house, sound almost like miracles when enough people echo them. I waited until the church was empty before I whispered. Not to Daniel, not to God, but to the air itself. They call it a miracle. I traced the shape of the pew with my trembling hand. I call it someone pretending to believe. I walked home from the church without feeling my feet touch the ground. The streets blurred past. Gray stones, wilting flowers, faces I didn't recognize. The only sound I could hear was that sentence, echoing in Daniel's borrowed voice. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It followed me like a hymn I couldn't shut off. By the time I reached the house, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the key twice. When the door finally opened, the smell of old paper rushed out. That familiar blend of dust and ink that once meant comfort. Now it smelled like a lie left too long in the light. The Bible lay where I'd left it on the table, open as if waiting. The candle beside it had burned itself out completely, leaving a thin curl of smoke. I sat down, exhaled slowly, and began to turn the pages one by one. Page after page, there were new lines. Neat, deliberate, written in that same handwriting. Some were corrections. Others were confessions. None of them were mine. He lied about mercy. She copied because she feared silence. Truth belongs to whoever dares to write last. The words crawled across the paper like veins, binding me tighter to a story I hadn't chosen. I whispered, "Enough." But the pages didn't listen. I fetched my magnifier, studied the strokes. The ink shimmered faintly blue. Not the dull black I use for restoration, not even Daniel's old brand. This was fresh, synthetic, modern. Someone had tampered with it. I wrapped the Bible in a linen cloth and carried it downtown to an old friend of Daniel's, Harold Briggs, a retired print technician. He worked now from his garage, surrounded by microscopes and spools of aging ribbon. When he saw the book, his brows lifted. "Still fixing the Lord's words, are you?" he said with a smile. "Not this time," I answered. "I just need to know if they've been rewritten." He looked puzzled but took the Bible, examined a page under his scope. After a minute, he frowned. "This isn't the ink you've used before, Miriam. The composition's different. High glycerin content, synthetic dye. You didn't buy this. No restorer would." "How new?" "Weeks, maybe days." I felt the air thin around me. "So, someone's been writing in it." "Or something," he said, trying to sound kind. He offered to keep the book overnight for more testing, but I took it back. Some instinct told me it needed to stay with me, not in anyone else's hands. Walking home, I realized how absurd it all sounded. A widow accusing invisible ink of blasphemy. Yet every word in that Bible had once been my devotion, my time, my marriage. Now it was someone else's weapon. That night, I sat at my desk long after midnight, staring at the silver pen in its glass case. The engraving, D and M. Coal, glimmered under the lamplight. For 35 years, that pen had been my tether to faith, my tool, my burden. I opened the case and held it. The metal was cool, heavier than I remembered. I uncapped it, pressed the nib against a blank sheet. Nothing came out. The cartridge was dry. Somehow, that felt fitting. I thought of Daniel's words before he died. Truth has no owner. Maybe not, but lies always do. I looked around the workshop, rows of sacred texts, hymnals waiting for repair, the faint smell of glue that never left the wood. Every book here bore the same silence that had raised me, shaped me, caged me. I realized that if I kept working for them, I'd be helping to preserve their version of God. The one that used my handwriting to hide their deceit. I stood up and reached for the light switch. The click echoed like a verdict. Then I began locking the cabinets, one by one. I slid the metal bolt on the front door. I unplugged the desk lamp. Each small act felt like reclaiming something I'd lost, my time, my voice, my will. Finally, I turned the key in the drawer where the church records were kept. The label read, "Client, St. Matthew Parish. Restoration ongoing." I tore it off, crumpled it, and dropped it into the trash. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my pulse. For the first time in years, I didn't pray. Instead, I spoke out loud to the empty room. To Daniel, to God, to whoever had been pretending to listen. If their faith needs a fraud to stand, I'll let it collapse. My voice didn't tremble this time. It sounded like mine. Steady, certain, older than fear. I placed the Bible on the table one last time, smoothed the cover, and drew the curtains. The house plunged into shadow, except for one thin ribbon of moonlight landing on the silver pen. I reached over, capped it, and set it beside the book. The soft click was almost tender, like the closing of a chapter that had been miswritten for too long. I stood there, breathing in the silence I had once been afraid of. Now it felt like air after a storm. Sharp, clean, full of beginnings. The week after I locked the workshop, the silence changed its shape. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It listened back. 3 days later, a white envelope arrived, bearing the red wax seal of St. Matthew Parish. I didn't need to open it to know the tone inside, but I did anyway. "Mrs. Cole, please return all manuscripts and copies of The Living Word belonging to the estate of Reverend Daniel Cole. Continued possession or reproduction will be treated as defamation against the Holy Church and its property." At the bottom, a line written in blue ink, "May God guide your repentance." I read it twice, then set it under the leg of my teapot to keep the paper from curling. By evening, the phone started ringing. First, it was the church treasurer, then a woman from the choir, Then, no one at all, just static. By the third day, even the mailman stopped waving through the window. When I walked to the grocer's, conversations cut off mid-sentence. People found very interesting things on the floor whenever I passed. The town had always been polite. Now it was reverent in the cruelest way, like I'd become a warning carved in stone. Inside my house, every clock ticked louder. The Bible stayed closed, tied in its linen cloth, but I swear I could feel it breathe. On the fifth night, someone knocked on my door. 3 slow raps. Measured. Confident. Through the frosted glass I saw the outline of a woman, tall, late 30s maybe, a scarf around her neck. Her posture was too straight for a beggar, too patient for a neighbor. I opened the door halfway. "Mrs. Cole?" Her voice was smooth, trained. She carried a small leather portfolio. "Yes," I said. "I'm Clara Raines. I used to study under your husband. Theology department, Springdale College. I'm working on a biography about him." I almost laughed. "Another resurrection?" She smiled politely, unfazed. "He told us once that you were his hands. That you could copy anything, but that you'd never dare to read God's words by yourself." Her tone was casual, but something in it sliced deep. "Did he?" I said. "And what did he tell you God said about plagiarism?" Her smile thinned. "The church wants the manuscripts back. It would spare you a lot of trouble." I noticed then that her fingers were ink-stained. The faint bluish hue of modern cartridges. "You've been working with them," I said. She didn't answer, only looked past me into the hallway where the shadows of my shelves lined up like witnesses. "They're worried you might alter his legacy," she said. "You've been emotional." "Understandably." I stepped closer. "Tell me, Miss Raines, did you write in my Bible?" A pause. Her pupils flickered just enough to confirm what words wouldn't. "The church calls it annotation," she murmured. "You should be grateful. Miracles need editors." For a moment I felt the world tilt. Then the anger settled, cool and sharp. "He used to tell me I'd never read God's words alone," I said quietly. "Well, I'm reading them now. And I've discovered your mentor just had very poor spelling." Her face tightened, but she recovered quickly. "You'll regret this defiance, Mrs. Cole. Faith protects the obedient. Then perhaps it's time Faith learned to spell my name right," I said and closed the door. The knock came again once, then twice, and then silence. I waited until her footsteps faded down the path before locking every bolt. Outside, the night pressed against the glass like water. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the leftover scent of her perfumed cheap lilac, the kind sold at church gift shops. They'd sent her as a messenger, maybe as a threat, maybe both. Either way, it meant one thing. They knew I wasn't backing down. The next morning, another letter appeared. No seal this time, just my name typed neatly on the envelope. Inside was a single sentence. "Return what isn't yours, or we'll teach you who owns the truth." No signature. No prayer. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, beside Daniel's photograph. He looked calm, as always, half smile, half warning. For years, I had worked to preserve other people's words. Now I was learning how easily they could turn those words into weapons. That evening, I made tea and sat by the window, watching the fog crawl over the rooftops. The town bell rang 7 times. No one knocked again. The house felt heavier, but inside that weight was something new, something steady. I realized fear had changed sides. They scheduled the parish meeting for a Thursday evening, the sort of night chosen for tedious budgets and bake sale sign-ups, so no one would expect a fire. The air smelled like floor polish and old lilies. Folding chairs lined the parish hall, each with a paper program tucked beneath a plastic cup of water. On the far wall, a banner read, "Heritage and Truth." Someone had added a paper dove with a gold sticker halo. It looked like a child's idea of peace, taped over a bruise. I came early and sat near the back with a canvas satchel on my lap. Inside were Daniel's drafts, the ones no one had ever seen, the ones he never gave the pulpit. I ran my finger along the satchel's zipper as if it were prayer beads, counting down to the moment I could stop being quiet. By 7, the hall had filled with the usual parish faces: choir women with stiff hair, retirees with ironed shirts, a few young parents still smelling faintly of baby soap and fatigue. Near the lectern stood Father Alden, straight-backed, hands folded like a clasped book. Next to him was Clara Raines in a navy dress, her leather portfolio tucked under one arm. When she saw me, she smiled the way a doctor smiles at a patient who won't accept the diagnosis. On the first row, I saw my son Matthew, jaw tight, tie too narrow, the posture of a man who wanted to look like he couldn't be pushed. He had flown in that morning to help, which meant to keep me from embarrassing myself. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Beside him sat a man I didn't recognize, pale and efficient, with a briefcase under his chair. A lawyer, I guessed, the kind who could turn a mother into an obstacle with a single stapled page. When the church bell struck the hour, Father Alden stepped to the microphone. "Friends," he began, "we're grateful for your presence. We gather not to quarrel, but to tell the truth about our beloved Reverend Daniel Cole and to preserve his legacy." His voice had that smooth lacquer I used to admire. Tonight, it just made me itch. He talked about Daniel's ministry, about the miraculous annotations found in his Bible, about how God still speaks to those who will listen. Words like continuity and heritage and reverence filled the room like fog. I felt the drafts in my bag grow heavier with each syllable, as if paper could protest. Then he said my name. "Mrs. Miriam Cole is here, of course, whose devotion gifted us the very documents we now protect." He gestured toward a folding table draped in white cloth. On it sat the Bible from my study, like a specimen under a museum light. Clara slid to the lectern next, portfolio open, smile unwavering. "As some of you know," she said, "I had the privilege of studying under Reverend Cole. He believed truth is alive. He believed words evolve as we do. He believed his wife's hand was the bridge for the holy." "He believed many things," I said, standing before I could give fear time to argue. "Some of them he never said out loud." My voice cut the room like a crease along a page. Heads turned. I walked down the center aisle, past people who pretended they didn't recognize me, past the man with the briefcase, past my own son whose lips pressed into a polite line. At the front, I set my canvas satchel on the table beside the Bible. I reached in, pulled out a stack of rough-edged pages bound with twine. Daniel's handwriting on onion skin paper stared back at me. Uneven, sincere, not yet burnished for public use. "These are Daniel's," I said. "Drafts he never authorized for the pulpit. If we are to keep his legacy, let's keep him, not the ventriloquist behind him." A murmur ran through the room. Clara's smile cooled. Father Alden's eyes slid to the lawyer. Matthew half rose, then sat again, caught between two kinds of obedience. I untied the twine. My hands had no tremor now. I chose a page, held it up to the microphone light, and read, "God is not in the building that insists you stop asking questions. God lives in the person who keeps asking why, even after the sermon ends." Silence fell so completely, I heard the hum of the fluorescent bulbs. Something in the room leaned toward me, then away. I turned another page. If we bind truth to our signatures, it's no longer truth. It's possession. Then I lifted a third. Mercy is not an absolution for the powerful. Mercy belongs first to the one who can finally name the harm. A cough, a clink of a cup, the scrape of a chair leg. Small human sounds that felt louder than the bell had been. Father Alden moved first, smile stitched tight. "Mrs. Cole?" he said, voice careful. "Those appear to be notes, private meditations, not doctrine." "And the sentences you read last Sunday?" I asked softly. "Those were doctrine? Or were they convenient?" Clara stepped in, tone bright with varnish. "What Mrs. Cole means." "What I mean," I said, and every vowel found its edge, "is that none of those miraculous lines were my husband's. They were added after his death, by someone who wanted his voice but not his doubts." The lawyer stood, adjusting his tie as if it too needed legal counsel. "Mrs. Cole, on behalf of St. Matthew's, I must formally ask you to return any and all materials belonging to the Reverend's estate. You've been advised. You'll receive what belongs to you, I answered. But these. I spread the drafts like a fan. These belong to him. And to the truth, you keep borrowing his name to avoid. Matthew finally spoke, his voice too gentle. Mom, please, this isn't the way. I turned to him and saw the boy hiding inside the man. The boy who had watched me stitch spines by lamplight, who had fallen asleep with paper scraps stuck to his pajamas. No, Matthew, I said. For 35 years, the ways was me keeping quiet while the men with microphones spoke. Tonight I'm choosing a door with hinges. A low ripple of laughter broke and died. Someone in the back clapped once, then stopped, embarrassed by their own spine. Clara reached for the nearest draft. I put my hand over it. Don't, I said. Your ink stains are new. I can smell the glycerin from here. She froze. The lawyer made a note he would later claim was not an admission of anything. Father Alden's face flushed a polite red. The shade people call rosy until it steps over the line into rage. These accusations are unbecoming, he said. Reverend Cole was a man of peace. He would be horrified to see you cause division. He would be horrified, I said, to hear his doubts turned into weapons against the people asking them. I lifted another page. The paper was thin enough to show the shadow of my hand through it. This is Daniel, 2 winters before he died. Truth is not a choir. It doesn't harmonize to please the room. It stands alone until someone else is brave enough to sing off-key with it. A woman in the second row gasped. I recognized her. She'd once given me a casserole, the kind whose recipe is older than marriage. She looked at the Bible on the table as if it had just told a lie about her dead mother. Then it happened fast. Father Alden stepped forward, snatched the top half of the stack, and with a single furious motion, ripped the pages across the grain. The sound tore the room in two. I felt it in my teeth. These are private, he snapped. You have no right to shame the church with the wanderings of a dying mind. My hand moved before thought could catch it. I reached into the satchel and pulled out the silver pen. The one engraved D&M Cole. The one that had been our covenant and my chain. I held it up so the light struck the engraving, so even the person hiding behind the ficus could see. This, I said, and my voice was not loud but it carried, is the only relic he left that matters. I took a breath. My ribs felt like open shutters finally catching wind. Not the book you keep rewriting. Not the sermon you keep polishing. This. The tool that recorded his truth and my labor. The thing none of you can forge without stealing my life with it. A dozen faces flinched as if I'd lifted a blade. Maybe I had. I set the pen on the white cloth between the Bible and the torn drafts, a border drawn in metal. Clara recovered her smile, but it had the wrong temperature now. We're not stealing, Mrs. Cole. We're curating. The people need guidance. Then guide them to ask why, I said. Guide them to live without a ventriloquist. Guide them to the part of faith that doesn't fear a question like it's a knife. The lawyer cleared his throat. We could resolve this quietly in my office, he offered, which meant out of sight. No, I said, we're in the right room. Truth hates closed doors. I picked up a torn scrap from the floor. Daniel's handwriting severed mid-sentence and faced the hall. For years, I was the pair of hands that made his words legible, I said. Tonight, I'm using my mouth. I read the scrap aloud even though it ended before it could save itself. And if the church ever asks you to trade your conscience for comfort, remember that comfort was never promised. The end was missing. The room felt that absence like a draft under a locked door. Matthew stood again, looking older than me for a second. Mom, he said softly, what if you're wrong? I turned, and the answer came with a strange gentleness. Then God can correct me. Not a committee. He sat down slowly, as if the chair had shifted under him into something less forgiving. From the 5th row, a man I didn't know spoke up, voice careful. If those annotations were added after Reverend Cole passed, that should be investigated. Others nodded, small at first, then larger. The murmurs changed timbre, from disapproval to curiosity, from certainty to the awkward music of doubt. Even the banner on the wall looked embarrassed by its own optimism. Father Alden's hands trembled. He turned to the Bible, opened it to a random page, and thrust it toward me as if to prove something. "The word stands," he declared. "With or without your permission." "The word stands," I said, "but this ink crawls." I leaned to the mic. "The ink analysis shows a synthetic composition I've never used. Dyes that weren't sold when Daniel was alive. If the church wants to own the miracle, it will also have to own the forger." Clara's mouth opened. "Closed!" The lawyer's pen stopped mid-note. The room tilted toward me again. This time not to argue, but to hear the thing it had been taught to fear. I took the Bible gently, like a sleeping animal, and set it beside the pen. I placed my palm over the cover, not to claim it, but to quiet it. "You keep asking me to return what isn't mine," I said. "So tonight, I am returning something." I slid the pen across the cloth until it sat in the dead center of the table, where anyone could see their own reflection in its barrel. "You may keep the building. Keep the microphones. Keep the banner and the dove and the word heritage, if it helps you sleep." I picked up the torn drafts, cradled them as if they were something that could bleed. "But my soul will not be catalogued." No one clapped. No one dared. The quiet had the gravity of a verdict. I breathed in the scent of lilies, paper dust, human sweat, and the metallic ghost of torn staples. Somewhere a baby fussed once, then quieted, as if reminded that noise is a choice. When I spoke again, the words were simple. They didn't ask permission. They didn't apologize. "I don't need anyone to read prayers for my soul anymore." The sentence sat between us like a bell that doesn't ring because silence is louder. I gathered the drafts back into my satchel, tied the twine, and looked at my son. He looked back at me with a face I remembered from when he was 8 and learned that truth and comfort weren't married. They were neighbors who barely spoke. I turned from the table. The hall parted without a word. Shoes scuffed. A chair creaked. No one touched me. At the door, I paused. The air outside smelled like rain waiting for permission. I could have left then, vanished into the kind of night where women walk home alone and are mistaken for ghosts. Instead, I looked back once. Not at the priest, not at the lawyer, not even at Clara, but at the silver pen on the table. Its reflection held the hall upside down. Banner, faces, Bible, me. The image wavered and steadied, like a truth forgotten and remembered in the same breath. Then I stepped into the evening, carrying only what belonged to me, my feet, my voice, my decision, and the quiet that finally sounded like mine. The morning after the meeting, my name became a headline. Someone had filmed the entire thing. My voice, my hands, the silver pen gleaming under the fluorescent lights. And by dawn, the video was everywhere. Widow of Reverend Cole accuses church of fraud. Local restore. Claims miraculous. Scriptures were fake. Underneath, the comments multiplied like weeds. Poor woman. Clearly senile. She wants attention. Grief makes people say terrible things. Pray for her mind. By the third hour, a new rumor appeared. Miriam Cole is under psychiatric observation. I hadn't left the house. I hadn't even opened the curtains. But the internet had already rewritten me. By afternoon, my phone vibrated non-stop voicemails, messages, notifications. Each one, another variation of pity disguised as prayer. Then came a text from Matthew. Short, cold. "Matthew, Mom, you need to stop. You're hurting Dad's legacy." Me? Whose legacy? Matthew, his work, his faith, and mine. We're both still part of the church. Me. Then be part of it honestly. "Matthew, please, just delete the video." He didn't sign it. Love, Matt. He didn't call. And when I tried to phone him back, the line went to voicemail on the first ring. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the screen until the battery died. The kettle whistled itself empty. Outside, the mailbox clanged once, then went still. The next day, the letter arrived. Not typed this time. Handwritten, on church stationery, in Clara's careful script. "Mrs. Cole, your actions have caused deep distress within the parish community. The council requests that you issue a formal statement retracting your claims, or face legal action for defamation and the misuse of sacred material. You were once a guardian of our heritage. Please do not become its destroyer. C.R. On behalf of St. Matthew Parish. At the bottom, she'd drawn a neat line under her initials. A signature, too. Self-assured for someone pretending to be humble. I burned the letter in the sink. The flame curled the paper inward like a body protecting itself. By evening, the church had posted their own statement online. Polished, rehearsed, merciless. We grieve for Mrs. Cole and pray for her swift recovery. Trauma can distort memory, and grief can invent its own miracles. Within hours, my email filled with invitations to appear on talk shows and podcasts. One of them promised to help me tell my side of the story. I didn't reply. The more I said, the more they'd call it hysteria. Silence, I was learning, could be a weapon too, but silence has a cost. The town's friendliness evaporated overnight. The grocer refused to take my check. The neighbor's kids stopped walking my dog. A note appeared on my gatepost. We trusted you with the word. You betrayed it. It was signed simply, The Faithful. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom and started keeping the Bible locked in a wooden chest in the kitchen. Every night I could hear it whisper, or maybe that was just memory turning into sound. A week later, the story took a crueler turn. A photo of me entering the post office, head down, envelope in hand, circulated online. The caption read, "Disgraced widow delivers fake documents to reporters." The envelope had been a bill payment. Truth doesn't need to be big to be erased. It only needs to be small enough to ignore. That night, Matthew came to see me. The last time he visited, we'd argued about who would take Daniel's books. He'd chosen the shelves that looked good on camera. He knocked once, then twice. When I opened the door, he stood there in his pressed shirt and church badge. Behind him, the car headlights carved halos in the fog. "Mom, they're saying you're unstable," he said. "You have to end this before it gets worse." "For who?" I asked. "For me or for your donors?" He flinched. "This isn't about money." "Then what is it about?" "They rewrote your father's words." "You're seeing ghosts, Mom. You've been alone too long." He stepped inside, glancing around the house like an inspector. The air smelled of tea leaves and smoke from the burned letter. "You should come stay with me," he said. "Get some rest. Let people forget." Forget is the word they use for bury. "Mom." "You work for them now," I said quietly. "Don't you?" He didn't answer. His silence was permission enough. "They told you to talk to me," I said. "They gave you the script, just like they gave your father his sermons." Matthew exhaled sharply, the sound of someone tired of the wrong truth. "Dad was a good man. He believed in order. He built something worth preserving. He built it with my hands." He shook his head, backing toward the door. "You're not well," he said finally. "When you're ready to apologize, the church will listen." "Tell them I already did," I said. "Once every Sunday, for 35 years. They just never noticed it was me talking." He left without looking back. I watched his taillights vanish down the road, small red wounds fading into dark. For a few days, the world seemed to quiet down again, but I could feel the tremor underneath it. Something was moving. I started seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the corner. Calls came from blocked numbers that hung up after the first hello. I thought it was paranoia, until the night I saw Clara again. I had gone out to the porch to bring in the mail, and there she was, standing by the gate under the streetlight. The scarf from before was gone. Her hair fell loose, catching the yellow glow. "Still keeping secrets in the dark?" I asked. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," she said. "We were offering you protection." "From what?" "From yourself." She stepped closer. Her perfume lilac again, faint, insistent, hit me like déjà vu. "The church doesn't need an enemy," she said softly. "It needs a successor. Someone who understands what Daniel meant to the world." "You mean someone who can finish rewriting him?" Her eyes glittered, a mix of pride and pity. "I was his student, Mrs. Cole. He shared everything with me, drafts, letters, confessions. You were his wife, but you never understood his faith." "I understood his handwriting." She smiled then, small and cruel. He wanted his words to live on. I made sure they did. Something cold ran through me. You added the annotations, I said. I completed them, she corrected. You left his Bible unfinished. I gave it voice. I stepped closer, lowering my voice until the night itself had to lean in to hear. You forged a man's voice to build your own sermon. You wanted his pulpit, not his truth. The world doesn't care who wrote the words, she said. Only whose name is printed under them. Her calmness was more terrifying than her threat. You think this is faith? I said. It's plagiarism dressed as prophecy. And you think anyone will believe you now? She asked. You're a lonely old woman with a story no one wants to read. For a second, I almost believed her. Then, the anger cleared my sight like a wind over glass. Then I'll write it myself, I said. She tilted her head, curious. Write what? The truth. Word for word, line for line. Let's see which version the world chooses when it has both. She laughed quietly, as if I'd told her something sweetly naive. You really don't understand the business you're in. Oh, I do, I said. You don't want faith. You want copyright. Her smile faltered. I turned and closed the gate between us. The following morning, Clara's face appeared on every church-affiliated website. The voice of Reverend Cole lives on. The article described her as the spiritual heir to the Reverend's mission, a scholar of divine continuity. There was even a photo. Her hands placed gently on Daniel's Bible, the same one I'd kept under lock for decades. My chest burned. The caption read, Through her dedication, the Reverend's last words will continue to inspire generations. Underneath, a line that made my stomach twist. Approved by his family. I stared at the sentence until it blurred. Matthew's name was listed in the acknowledgments. He'd signed away the truth. For them. For safety. For belonging. That night, I drove to the church grounds for the first time since the confrontation. The doors were locked, but I didn't need to go inside. Through the window, I could see the display case. My Bible, my handwriting, sitting under new lights, labeled as The Final Works of Reverend Daniel Cole, edited by C. Reyns. They had done it. They had canonized the forgery. I went home and sat in the dark. For hours. The world outside moved. Cars, dogs, people, everything ordinary. But inside my house, it felt like Judgment Day had already passed and everyone else had been forgiven but me. Around midnight, I lit a candle and placed it beside the silver pen. Its reflection shimmered in the waxy glow, steady and unflinching. I opened my notebook and began to write. Not to them, not for them. For myself. For myself. He said God hides in ink. Maybe he does. But some inks are poison, and some hands are thieves. The words came easier than I expected. Years of silence turned into sentences. I wrote until the candle guttered, until my hand cramped, until I could hear the first birds testing the edge of dawn. When I finished, I read the last line aloud to the empty room. They never wanted faith, they wanted ownership. I capped the pen and whispered into the quiet. They don't want belief. They want copyright. I hadn't been back to the university archives in almost 20 years. The building still smelled of old air and static ozone from the microfilm machines that had outlived their keepers. Dust glowed in thin shafts of light. Rows of drawers labeled with years, initials, sermons. I used to come here with Daniel, back when he believed eternity could be preserved on acetate reels. He'd dictate, I'd copy. He called it our ark of words. Now I was here to pull that ark apart plank by plank. The clerk at the desk, a man half my age with headphones and a coffee stain on his sleeve, didn't look up when I said my name. He just asked for my ID and typed. We still have your old access file, he said finally. Cole, Miriam E., microfilm cabinet 9B. He paused, glancing at the screen. These were your husband's? No, I said. They were mine. I just let him borrow them for a lifetime. He didn't understand, but he didn't need to. I found the reel exactly where I had left it, label worn, ink faded, the word Cole barely legible. I threaded it onto the viewer, heart stuttering with each turn of the crank. The images flickered onto the screen. Daniel's drafts. Every verse and note I had ever copied before the edits. My handwriting. My ink. My proof. The words scrolled past like a ghost's confession. Truth has no keeper. Silence is not holiness. Forgiveness means naming the sin before forgiving it. None of the forgeries. None of Clara's polite poison. Only Daniel's messy, earnest humanity and my corrections in the margins. I printed every page the machine would give me, the paper warm against my palms. The clerk eyed the growing stack but said nothing. When I left, I carried it pressed against my chest, like a second heart that finally beat in rhythm again. That night, I called Harold Briggs, the retired print technician who'd once tested the ink. He answered on the second ring, voice heavy with whiskey and loyalty. "You were right," he said before I could speak. "The church's copies use modern dye. The analysis is conclusive. Can you help me make it public?" He hesitated then. "You thinking legal route?" "No. Truth shouldn't need a lawyer." He chuckled softly. "Then you'll need a megaphone." 2 days later, I met him at his friend's small newspaper office downtown. The Herald Ledger. 3 rooms, 1 broken coffee machine, and the faint smell of hope trying to stay employed. Behind a desk stacked with draft pages sat Ruth Gardner, a journalist I hadn't seen since college. She'd aged the way truth-tellers do. Creases carved by laughter and disbelief in equal measure. "Miriam Cole," she said, standing to hug me. I saw the video. Brave woman or crazy one. I couldn't decide which. "They usually mean the same thing," I said. I laid the microfilm prints on her desk. "I have the originals, the ones Daniel actually wrote. The ones they've changed." She skimmed a few lines, eyebrows rising. "You're telling me they've been preaching edited scripture?" "Not scripture," I said. "Marketing." She leaned back, exhaled slowly. "We'll run it, front page. But you have to be ready, Miriam. They'll call you worse than mad this time." "They already have. Might as well earn it." For the next week, Ruth and Harold worked like surgeons. They verified every page, traced every ink composition, every timestamp, every reel number. Each confirmation cut another thread from the web the church had woven. They titled the piece, "The Words God Never Said." The headline alone felt like an exorcism. My job was to give the statement, on record, on camera. The idea of speaking terrified me. For decades, I had been the hand behind the voice, not the voice itself. But Ruth insisted, "People need to see your eyes when you tell them," she said. "They need to see belief that isn't for sale." So I practiced. Every night, I stood before the mirror in my workshop, the silver pen lying on the table beside the lamp. I rehearsed the lines slowly, shaping each word until it sounded like something I could live with forever. My name is Miriam Cole. For 35 years, I restored the written word. I never imagined I'd have to restore the truth itself. Sometimes my reflection looked brave. Sometimes it looked ancient. But every time, I said the words a little louder. These new annotations? They aren't revelation. They're revision. They weren't written by my husband, nor by God. They were written by someone who wanted ownership more than honesty. I stumbled on the last sentence, always, the one that mattered most. The line that was supposed to close the interview, to ring in people's minds after the credits rolled. The first few times, my voice broke before I reached it. My throat dried. The mirror seemed to lean away from me, embarrassed. Ruth would stand off to the side, holding the camera steady. Harold adjusted the light. After my 5th attempt, Ruth stopped me gently. "You don't have to shout at Miriam. Let the truth do the heavy lifting." I smiled, shaking my head. "No, not this time." She frowned. "You've got the evidence. They'll read it." "They've read his lies for years," I said. "This time, I want them to hear mine." Her expression softened. "Then say it again." I looked into the lens. I imagined the congregation's faces, the pews, the whispering, the years of being called obedient, faithful, good wife. I imagined Daniel somewhere above, or nowhere at all, watching the woman he never let speak. My reflection in the lens steadied. I said it clearly. The church can keep its miracles. I'm keeping my truth. Silence followed, long and holy. Ruth lowered the camera. That's the one. When the lights went off, we sat in the dark office listening to the printer hum as it spat out proofs of the article. Harold poured whiskey into chipped mugs. Tomorrow, Ruth said, sliding a proof toward me. We send this to every outlet that still remembers what journalism means. I traced the headline with my fingertip. The words God never said. The letters looked bold, irreversible. I didn't feel peace. I felt weight, honest, deserved, necessary. The kind that pins you to the moment so you can't drift into comfort. Harold raised his mug. To truth, he said. To noise, I replied. It's about time silence had competition. We laughed, tired and ready. Outside, the first drops of rain tapped the window, soft and rhythmic, like fingers counting down. I drove home with the article proofs on the seat beside me. The headlights carved tunnels through the fog. The city lights shimmered ahead, blurred by the storm about to break. In the rearview mirror, I caught my own eyes. Wide, alert, unafraid. For once, I didn't look like a witness. I looked like a warning. When I reached the house, I left the lights off. I placed the proofs on the kitchen table, right beside the Bible still bound in linen. I untied the cloth and opened it one last time. The pages were quiet, blank of new intrusions. Maybe they had finally learned respect. I laid the newspaper proof across the open Bible, aligning the edges. Ink over ink. Truth over lie. Then I whispered, to no one and to everyone. Don't worry, Daniel, I'm not copying your words this time. I picked up the silver pen, uncapped it, and signed the article's last page with a steady hand. Miriam E. Cole. The signature looked strange, real, alive, mine. I stared at it until the ink dried, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a shadow of his name beside it. They called it a celebration, but it felt more like a coronation. The 40th anniversary of St. Matthew's Parish drew a crowd large enough to choke the parking lot, television vans, parishioners in Sunday best, choir robes fluttering like flags. A banner stretched across the entrance. 40 years of faith. Faith, I thought, or 40 years of good printing. The invitation had come to me 3 days earlier, hand-delivered by the same courier who once brought tithing envelopes. The note inside was perfumed with incense. Mrs. Cole, you are invited to honor the legacy of Reverend Daniel Cole. His final writings will be presented tonight to the congregation and to the world. They wanted my presence to sanctify their theft. And that's exactly why I went. The rain from the night before had washed the city clean, but the sky remained gray, one of those neutral waiting colors. I dressed simply. Black skirt, dark jacket, no jewelry except for the silver pen clipped in my pocket like a relic of my own making. In my bag lay the microfilm reel, the ink analysis certificate, and one printed proof of the article, The Words God Never Said. Ruth had already scheduled it for release at 8:00 p.m., 10 minutes after the broadcast began. Inside the church, light streamed through the stained glass like liquid fire. The choir rehearsed softly in the background, voices slipping up the scale and vanishing. Technicians moved around the pulpit, adjusting microphones. A banner behind the altar read, The Word Continues. Clara stood near the front, clipboard in hand, headset on, every inch the chosen heir. When she saw me, her eyes widened for a heartbeat, just long enough to betray fear, then narrowed into the smile of a professional liar. Mrs. Cole, she said smoothly, I wasn't sure you'd come. You invited me. Out of courtesy, she said. You were part of the history after all. You mean the part that still remembers how it started? Her jaw flexed, but she turned away before answering. The pews filled quickly. The cameras blinked red. The organ's first chord rolled like thunder through marble. Father Alden stepped to the podium, radiant under the lights, voice trained for broadcast. Tonight, he began, we celebrate not only 40 years of service, but the living proof that God still speaks through his faithful. Applause. A few amends. He gestured toward the glass case beside him. My Bible, the one that had been rewritten. Its pages were open to the forged annotations. Above it, a projector screen showed the text enlarged. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's signing your own verdict again. The audience murmured in reverence. These are the final revelations of Reverend Daniel Cole, Father Alden continued, restored and preserved by those who carry his flame. That was my cue. I rose from the third pew. The camera nearest me pivoted automatically, trained on the disturbance. "Excuse me," I said, walking toward the altar, voice clear enough to cut through the choir's fading hum. "Mrs. Cole," the father said, nervous smile fixed. "We are honored." "No," I interrupted. "You're not." The crowd stilled. My footsteps echoed against the stone floor. I climbed the 3 steps to the stage, each one heavier than the last. I placed my back on the lectern beside the Bible. "You're about to show the world Daniel's last words," I said. "But before you do, they should see the ones you erased." I drew out the microfilm reel, holding it up so the camera light gleamed through its surface. "This contains every page Daniel ever wrote," I said. "Unedited. Untouched. Copied by me before any of you learned his name." Then I lifted the certificate of ink analysis, the document stamped and signed by Harold. "And this," I continued, "proves that your so-called miracle, the new handwriting that appeared in his Bible, was written with modern synthetic dye. A formula created 8 years after Daniel's death." Gasps rippled through the pews. The choir master lowered his baton. A woman in the front row made the sign of the cross. Father Alden stepped forward, flustered. "Mrs. Cole, please, this is not the time." "This is exactly the time," I said. "You've had 40 years. Now it's my turn." I turned to the projection technician. "Show them reel number 47B, the last sermon Daniel ever wrote." The man hesitated, looking to the father for permission. Alden shook his head sharply. "Play it," I ordered, voice steady. "Or you'll prove everything I've said." He obeyed. The lights dimmed. The projector hummed. On the screen appeared the first frame of Daniel's original text. His handwriting, uneven and human. The words appeared in grainy white-on-black letters as the camera zoomed in. "God is not afraid of questions. The ones who fear questions are those who profit from answers." A stunned silence. The next frame. "If ever my words are used to cage another soul, then burn them. God will write new ones in their ashes." A whisper spread through the hall. People craned their necks, reading, realizing. Then came the last line, the one I had never read aloud until this moment. "If the church forgets that truth breathes outside its walls, then may someone, anyone, tear the walls down." The projector froze there. The image hung on the wall like judgment itself. Father Alden lunged for the controls, stammering. "This is sacrilege. This film is doctored." I reached into my pocket and drew out the silver pen. The cameras caught the glint. The crowd gasped again. "You recognize this, Father?" I asked. "Daniel's pen. The one that wrote every sermon you quote. The one that signed every donation check you cashed." He glared, sweating. "You're desecrating holy ground." "No," I said softly. "You already did." I set the pen on the open Bible, metal against paper, a sound sharper than thunder in that silence. "You wanted ownership of his words," I said, turning to the crowd. "You didn't want faith. You wanted copyright." A murmur rose. Someone clapped once. Another followed. Clara's voice cut through, strained and trembling. "You don't understand. He gave me those notes." "He gave no one his voice," I said. "You just learned how to imitate his handwriting." Her face drained of color. "You can't prove. I already did." I handed the ink certificate to one of the reporters from the Herald Ledger. Ruth had made sure they were in the audience. He lifted it for the camera. The cameraman zoomed in on the date, the signature, the lab seal. On the projector, Daniel's handwriting stayed frozen, glowing faintly like a ghost that refused to fade. The crowd erupted. Questions, accusations, prayers muttered under breath. Some shouted for truth, Others demanded silence. Father Alden pounded the lectern for order, but the microphones caught only the tremor in his hand. "This is heresy," he shouted. "She twists the words of a dying man." "No," I said, stepping forward. "You twisted the words of a living one." I looked straight into the nearest camera, its red light blinking like an unblinking eye. "If God is silent," I said, "maybe he's waiting for someone to finally tell the truth." That line wasn't in Daniel's notes. It was mine. And the moment it left my mouth, I knew it would outlive me. The audience fell utterly still. Even the reporters stopped moving. The sentence hung in the air, heavy and unnegotiable. Then, chaos. The feed cut for a second, someone backstage trying to kill the broadcast, but it was too late. The live stream had already been mirrored online, shared by thousands. The words, "God never said" article went live at that exact minute with the same evidence I'd just presented. The headlines flashed across phone screens in the pews. "Forged faith. Church indicted Reverend's final writings. New evidence reveals." Manipulation of scripture. People began to stand, murmuring, some weeping, some furious. The choir dissolved into fragments of sound. Clara backed toward the wings, headset slipping off her ear. Alden tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "This is blasphemy. Turn off the cameras." The cameraman didn't move. The red light kept blinking. I turned back to the audience, steady despite the storm. "Daniel believed truth has no keeper," I said. "You made it your property. You built a pulpit out of his bones. But the truth doesn't need walls or signatures. It just needs breath." A woman in the third row whispered, "Amen." Another echoed her. Then a man near the back said it louder. "Amen." It spread, not as worship, but as agreement. The father sagged against the pulpit, face pale as candle wax. Reporters flooded the aisle. Flashbulbs went off like lightning. Clara tried to slip out a side door, but Ruth intercepted her with a microphone. "Miss Rains," she asked sharply, "were you aware the added text was modern forgery?" "No comment," Clara snapped, covering her face. I almost pitied her. Almost. I walked back to the Bible. The camera followed me. I closed it gently, palms pressed over the cover like sealing a wound. "Enough of other people's words," I said. "I think God's earned a pause." The crowd laughed softly, nervous, relieved, human. I turned to Ruth, who stood now among the journalists. She lifted her camera slightly, waiting. "You'll write this?" I asked. "Already am," she said. When I left the stage, people parted the aisle again, but differently this time. Not avoidance. Space, respect, maybe, or just awe at someone who'd set fire to a temple and walked out unburned. Outside, the air smelled like rain again. The sky had begun to clear, a faint silver bleeding into the clouds. Sirens wailed faintly somewhere downtown, news trucks racing toward the story. I stood on the church steps, watching as people poured out behind me, their voices overlapping, questions spilling like confetti. The truth was loose now. It didn't belong to me anymore. And that, I realized, was what freedom actually meant. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the silver pen one last time. The engraving caught the last bit of light, D&M Cole. I traced it with my thumb. "He hid God in ink," I whispered. "I found him in silence." I uncapped the pen and wrote on the back of my hand just one word. "Enough." Then I smiled, tucked the pen away, and walked down the steps into the noise of the living world. The morning after the broadcast, the world didn't end. It just sounded different. The phone rang until noon. Reporters, parishioners, strangers who wanted to thank me, others who wanted to damn me. By the third hour, I unplugged it. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was earned. I made tea, the same way I always had. 1 spoon of leaves, 2 of sugar, 1 minute past boiling. The ritual steadied me, proof that ordinary things still existed after truth exploded. When I looked out the window, the church spire was visible in the distance, sunlight sliding across its roof. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't flinch. They said the live stream had reached almost 500,000 views. They said Father Alden had taken a leave of absence. They said Clara had vanished. People always say a lot after a scandal. What they never say is how quiet life gets when the shouting ends. By afternoon, I decided to clean the workshop. Dust had collected on every surface, thin gray layers of what used to be my obedience. The books, the brushes, the bottles of glue all waiting for my hands like children who didn't yet know they were being left behind. I opened the windows. The wind came in like something that had been knocking for years. I began packing slowly. Not with grief. With precision. The brushes went first, then the drying press, then the ink bottles. Each object that left the table lightened the room until it started to resemble a place where a woman could breathe. I stacked the restored hymnals in a neat pile for donation. I burned the contracts from St. C. Matthews. The smoke curled up through the window, thin and harmless, disappearing before it reached the clouds. Only one thing remained on the work table: the silver pen. It lay exactly where I had placed it after the broadcast, catching the sunlight that filtered through the dusty glass. The engraving D&M Cole looked softer now, less like ownership, more like memory. I picked it up, turned it in my hand. The balance was perfect, the weight familiar. I uncapped it. The nib gleamed like the edge of something forgiven. For a moment, I thought of Daniel. Not the preacher, not the voice, but the man who once stayed up with me fixing a leaking roof with duct tape because the church had more important repairs. I remembered his laugh then, small and genuine, unrecorded. That version of him didn't need saving. He just needed someone to remember. He'd existed before they made him holy. I set the pen down gently, as if tucking him back into rest. As I turned to leave, a gust of wind pushed through the open window. The draft swept across the table, ruffling the pages of the Bible I'd kept since the beginning. It slid open to the very last page. One I'd always left blank out of respect, superstition, maybe fear. The blankness stared up at me, raw and honest. For the first time, I didn't see emptiness. I saw invitation. I sat down, pulled the Bible closer, and uncapped the silver pen once more. The metal was cool against my fingers. My hand didn't shake. On that last page, the one every editor had left untouched, I began to write. Slowly, carefully, in my own handwriting. At last, I believe in my own words. The ink sank cleanly into the page, no bleeding, no hesitation. I watched it dry, a line at a time, until the sentence settled like breath after a long cry. I leaned back. The wind shifted again, lifting the edge of the page just enough to make it whisper. Maybe the book was exhaling too. By dusk, the room was almost empty. I wiped down the table, the glass cabinets, the chair. The smell of paper and glue was replaced by something lighter. Air, rain, maybe freedom. When the last box was sealed, I sat on the floor with a cup of cold tea and let the quiet wrap around me. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel watched. The light from the window fell directly onto the open Bible, illuminating my sentence as if the sun had chosen it. At last, I believe in my own words. I realized that for all the sermons I'd copied, for all the prayers I'd whispered under someone else's name, this was the first scripture I'd ever written that belonged entirely to me. It didn't need translation. It didn't need approval. It just needed breath. Later that night, I carried the Bible outside. The grass was damp. The air smelled of rain and soil. I placed it on the porch railing, open to the final page, and let the wind do what it wanted. The pages fluttered softly, alive. Down the road, I could still hear faint echoes, people arguing, reporters speculating, believers defending. Let them. They were all still looking for God in the noise. I had found him in the quiet. When I went back inside, I left the workshop door open. The breeze kept moving through, light and patient, scattering the last of the dust. The silver pen remained on the table, alone but unlonely. I smiled. It had been a weapon, a tool, a promise, and now? It was simply a pen again. I didn't need it anymore. I'd already written what mattered. Before going to bed, I looked one last time at the empty room. The same space where I'd spent half my life copying other people's certainties. Now it was clean, echoing, and mine. If truth had a sound, I thought, it would be this silence. A year passed. The story the world had shouted over for months finally fell silent. The church recovered, at least the version of it that could afford to. New preachers came. New slogans appeared. People moved on, as they always do when the truth stops trending. But I didn't move backward or forward. I moved inward. I sold the old house and the workshop with it. I wanted walls that didn't remember. I found a small building on the corner of West Hill Street, a place that used to be a print shop. The windows were tall and bright. The air smelled of dust and ink, but the kind of ink that still had hope in it. I cleaned it myself, stripped the wallpaper, painted the walls cream. Then I hung a simple wooden sign by the door, Faait. The name made the neighbors curious. They'd come in and ask, "Is it a church?" "No," I'd tell them, "it's a workshop. We fix what people tried to erase." Inside, shelves lined the walls. Stacks of worn hymnals, burned diaries, notebooks half dissolved by time or shame. Women brought them to me in paper bags and cardboard boxes, like offerings. One woman brought her grandmother's prayer book that had been scribbled over by her father, every word she wrote crossed out and replaced with his. Another brought a journal full of pages torn in half by a husband who didn't like the way she remembered things. I taught them how to mend the torn spines, flatten the pages, fill in missing words. Not perfectly, just honestly. Don't make it look new, I'd say. Make it look like it survived. And slowly, these women began to see themselves in the things they repaired. On the far wall, I hung a glass case. Inside was the silver pen. It no longer wrote. I removed the cartridge the day I opened the atelier. The engraving had dulled with time, but it still caught the light in the afternoons. Beneath it, I had a plaque made. Nothing ornate, just brass, engraved in small serif letters. Written once, believed twice. Some visitors asked what it meant. I'd smile. It means we get to write our stories again, once for survival, once for truth. Every morning, I unlocked the atelier at 9, brewed coffee for whoever came early, and played the old radio Daniel had once fixed for me. The station never stayed tuned. Sometimes it caught a hymn, sometimes just static. I liked the static best. It sounded like breathing, like the world thinking before it spoke. By noon, the room would fill with soft chatter and a smell of glue and old paper. I'd walk among the tables, watching hands that had once been told to pray, now learn to create. One afternoon, a young woman named Lila, barely 30, sharp eyes, quiet voice, looked up from a ruined Bible she was restoring. She hesitated before asking, "Mrs. Cole, do you still copy scripture?" I paused, setting down the spool of thread I was using to rebind a hymnal. "No," I said. She looked surprised. "Not even for yourself?" I smiled, feeling the weight of that question settle gently between us. "No," I repeated. "I only copy the words that women were once told not to say." She nodded and went back to her work. Her fingers trembled less after that. In the evenings, when the atelier emptied and the air cooled, I'd sit by the window and write in my own journal. The first I'd ever kept for no one else. I didn't fill it with sermons or apologies. Just small things. The smell of ink, the laughter of my students, the color of the light at 5:00 p.m. The blank pages no longer scared me. They were space, not silence. Sometimes I thought about Daniel, not with bitterness, just with clarity. The man who believed he was chosen had been as trapped as I was, chained to the need to sound divine. Maybe we were both just two people afraid of being ordinary. But ordinary, I'd learned, is where truth lives. One day, Ruth came by, holding a freshly printed magazine. The headline read, "The Woman Who Rewrote Faith." I laughed. "They make it sound like a crime." She grinned. "Maybe it was, but it was the kind the world needed." She walked around the atelier, looking at the women working quietly at their tables. "You built something new, Miriam." "I didn't build it," I said. "I just left the door unlocked." Ruth stayed for tea. Before leaving, she asked what I planned to do next. I looked around the room, sunlight glinting off the glass case, dust dancing above the open books. Keep teaching, I said. Keep listening. Maybe even rest. She laughed. You? Rest? I might surprise you, I said. When she left, she squeezed my hand and whispered, You did it. I watched her go, then looked back at the women inside. None of us had truly done it. We were still mending, still learning. But maybe that was the point, faith that doesn't demand perfection, only persistence. That night, I stayed late. The rain returned, tapping softly against the windows. I turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the lamp above the silver pen. Its reflection shimmered in the glass case like a pulse. I walked over, placed my hand on the glass and whispered, You wrote for him once. You wrote for them 1,000 times. But this is mine. Then I turned off the lamp. The atelier fell into a peaceful half, dark, filled only with the faint hum of the street outside. I could almost hear pages turning in the quiet, the sound of women, across decades, writing themselves back into existence. The next morning, the first student to arrive found me already at my desk. I was binding a small notebook, its cover plain, its paper blank. She asked what it was for. For the next class, I said. We'll call it Reclaiming the Margins. She smiled. What will we write in it? I looked out the window at the sun breaking through the rain clouds. Whatever's been waiting too long to be said. That afternoon, the wind picked up again, slipping under the door and fluttering the open Bible on the shelf. The final page, the one where I'd written, At last, I believe in my own words, lifted slightly, then stilled. For a moment, I watched it, half expecting more wind, half expecting a miracle. But the page stayed quiet. That silence felt like blessing. Before closing, Lila came to the front desk holding her repaired Bible. The spine gleamed, imperfect but strong. Look, she said proudly, it doesn't close all the way anymore. Good, I said, neither should we. She laughed, then glanced at the case on the wall. That's a beautiful pen, she said softly. Do you ever miss using it? I thought for a second. Sometimes, I said. Then I remember, I still write every day. It's not for anyone's approval. She smiled, nodded, and left. When the door closed behind her, I looked again at the glass case, the faint reflection of my own face beside the pen. For the first time, I didn't look like a witness or a widow. I just looked like someone who'd survived the edit. Evening light filled the atelier, golden and forgiving. I stood at the doorway, watching the shadows stretch across the tables, the rows of restored books, the tiny miracles made by patient hands. The world outside was still flawed, still loud, still hungry for saints and scapegoats. But in this small corner of it, women were learning to write again. And maybe that was enough. I locked the door, turned the sign to closed, and whispered to the room. I'm not afraid of blank pages anymore. I took a deep breath, savoring the scent of ink and dust and new beginnings. For the first time, I said aloud, I know exactly what my hands are writing. The camera light blinked red. Ruth nodded from behind it, silent cue. Go ahead. I sat at my work table in the Faith Repair Atelier. The evening light slanted through the tall windows, painting long gold bars across the floor. Around me, the women had gone home. Only the scent of paper and glue remained, a perfume of creation and ghosts. I looked straight into the lens. No script, no notes, just truth. If one day, I began quietly, you find someone writing your story with their own hand, don't let them sign it. I let the words hang. They didn't need music or tears. They only needed air. For years, I thought silence was holiness. I thought obedience was faith. But silence is just a page someone else can fill for you. And obedience, well, that's the cheapest ink there is. I smiled faintly, not in anger, but in recognition of how far I'd come. They called what happened to me a scandal. I call it editing. I leaned closer to the camera so that the reflection of my face filled the frame. Maybe your story was rewritten too. Maybe your words were softened, or erased, or spoken in someone else's voice? If so, this is your invitation to take the pen back. The room was utterly still except for the faint hum of the old radio behind me, tuned between stations, whispering static like applause too shy to begin. I glanced at the glass case on the wall, the silver pen gleaming faintly under the lamp. That pen once wrote sermons that weren't mine. Then it wrote a truth that was. Now it doesn't write at all. Because I learned something. Sometimes, the holiest thing you can do is stop copying and start speaking. I folded my hands on the table. Don't wait for permission to tell your story. Don't let reverence become your cage. Faith isn't about repeating, it's about remembering. A pause. I wanted the next line to feel like a hand reaching out through the screen. So share this story. Not because it's mine, but because somewhere, someone else is still letting another hand write their belief, their name, their life. I took a slow breath. My voice lowered to almost a whisper. If you see them, remind them. The ink on their soul is still wet. They can change it. The camera light glowed brighter as Ruth zoomed in. People keep asking if I still believe in miracles. Yes, I said, but not the kind that happen in churches. The miracle is when a woman finally hears her own sentence, spoken in her own voice, and knows it's true. I smiled again, softer this time. If you've been quiet too long, this is your sign to start writing again. No one gets to hold the pen forever, not even the ones who say they speak for God. The clock ticked somewhere behind me. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, as if the world itself was turning a page. I thought about Daniel, about the girl I used to be, about the thousands of pages I'd written for everyone but myself. And I thought about this one moment. Me, the camera, the light, the truth, finally mine. Maybe this is the end of my story, I said. Or maybe it's just the first time I've told it with my own handwriting. I could feel tears gathering, but not from sorrow, from clarity. So if you're listening, if you're still there, write something tonight. Anything. A sentence, a word, your name. Let it be ugly. Let it be real. Let it be yours. The hum of the radio rose for a second, then faded back to quiet. I looked straight into the lens one last time. If one day you find someone writing your story with their own hand, don't let them sign it. Share this story. Because somewhere out there, someone is still letting another hand write their faith. I paused, letting the stillness hold me. Then, with a small breath, the kind that comes after decades of holding one too long, I said the final line. My story closes here. But maybe, just maybe, it's the first time I've ever written my soul by hand.